I don't know, have you guys ever met anybody or maybe been a part of something that thinks it's really good, that thinks they're really great? Maybe it's a sports team or a musician or even a church that thinks it's really good, but in reality it's actually really bad. And I don't know about you, but if you've ever seen any of these people or met them, the funny thing is that they think they're really good, but it's pretty obvious to everybody around them that it's really bad. And we're gonna watch just a quick video, and maybe some of you have seen it before, but it kind of illustrates that very thing. So the next 3 weeks we're going to be looking at the church in Corinth, and a lot like the guy up there, the church in Corinth is a church that thinks that it's really good, and it thinks that it's a star. It thinks that it's really great, and in reality it's not. And the sad thing is for the Corinthians is that they're not bad at music, and for the Corinthians they're not bad at preaching, and they're not bad at VBS, and it's not that they don't mow their grass. The problem for the Corinthian church is that they're bad morally. All right, and so you have this church that thinks that it's really good. Paul actually calls them arrogant. They think that they're great, but in reality, they're really, really bad. You have a church that thinks that it's pleasing to God, and it thinks that it's holy, and thinks that it's doing the work of the Lord, but in reality, it's a church that's just really, really awful. Really awful. And I know that Gene's Sunday school class has been studying 1 Corinthians, and maybe some of you are familiar with the letter, but the Corinthian church is one that has issues with authority. It's divisive, and then the sins go on and on. I mean, the church has problems with sexual sin, with drunkenness, with idolatry. It has problems with its worship. And even when the church comes together, they can't do communion. The church is so bad that they can't even do the basic things right. They can't even do the basic things right. And so there's this church in Corinth that thinks it's really good, and it's just really awful. So for the next 3 weeks, we're going to take a break from Romans, and we're going to be looking at 3 different passages in 1 Corinthians. It's another letter by Paul. Obviously, we're not going to hit up every part of the letter. We're going to look at 3 passages, and I think this is the longest passage that we're going to look at. And so I want to ask if you guys have time throughout the week. I would recommend take some time and read the letter of 1 Corinthians. Maybe you can read it in one sitting. It takes like an hour and a half maybe to read, maybe even less than that. If you get a chance on your commute, put it on the Bible app. You can listen to it. But find a way, if you can, over the next week to familiarize yourself with the letter. It'll put a little bit more context, and I think you'll be challenged in a lot more than just the 3 passages that I'm going to look at. But when we look at Corinthians, like I said, it's a church that thinks that it's really good, and in reality it's really bad. And the passage that we're looking at this morning here demonstrates it. And so this morning I want to look at 3 things. We're going to look at 3 things. First, we're going to look at what the problem is. And then we're going to look at what Paul's solution to the problem is. And then the last thing we're going to ask is that question we all ask, which is why. Why does Paul say what he does? Why is that Paul gives that instruction? And so I think, though, that the problem's pretty easy for us to figure out. You know, if you're ever in church and they ask you what the problem is, it's a pretty safe bet that you can just say the problem is sin. All right? The problem in the Corinthian church is sin. Right away, verse 1 and 2. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you. I'm reading from the ESV, but and of a kind that is not tolerated even among the pagans. For a man has his father's wife. And you are arrogant. Ought not you rather to mourn? So there's a guy, it's an individual guy in the church that's in Corinth that's sleeping with his father's wife, his stepmother. It's not good. It's pretty bad. Paul even goes on to say that it's so bad that everybody who's outside the church is looking in and saying, that's bad. So you know you have a problem in your church when the people who aren't in church are saying, that's bad. That's really bad. And the crazy thing is everybody knows it. So here's a guy, a person who's in the church, a church member, a Christian, who's sinning publicly. Everyone in the church knows about it. I mean, I always think how awkward it must be when, you know, they go up there and they read Paul's letter, and there the guy is sitting there in the pew, you know. He's got to be sweating. He's like, uh-oh, I don't know who that is. Everybody knows about it, and it's so bad that even the people who aren't Christians, who don't even know what sin is, they know that that's wrong. And it's not something that's terribly unfamiliar with us today. I was reading an article in the news a couple weeks ago, and maybe some of you saw it, of this Catholic cardinal from Australia who was, I guess, arrested for some sort of sex crimes or something. And it's one of the closest advisors to the Pope in the Catholic Church. And so here's a story that we see all the time. Someone who's in church leadership, someone who's high up in the church, and who's guilty of sin. And everybody knows about it. Everybody knows about it. Everybody knows it's wrong. Even that guy, I was reading the article, and even the cardinal knew it was wrong. Now, he said he was innocent, but he knew it was wrong. He said so himself. Everybody knew it was wrong. And yet, it was happening in the church. And in Corinth, as it is often the case today, it's not just an individual that's sinning. It's not just a guy in the church that's sinning, but it's the whole community that has the problem. The letter of 1 Corinthians isn't written to this dude, this creepy dude with his sexual sin. It's not written to him. Paul's not wasting his time writing to that guy. The letter's written to the church, and the problem is with the church. The problem that Paul's addressing isn't that sin. He's addressing the church's response to that sin. And it's a really big problem. And as I'm reading this and I'm thinking about it, I've seen, and I'm sure that some of you have seen this sort of thing in the church, this sort of indifference towards sin. Actually, it's worse than indifference. Paul describes them as arrogant. They're proud of their sin. It's almost as if they're happy with it, or they don't care, it's all good. And I've seen, though, I've been to churches where, and I've been a part of ministries where you have somebody who's up front, you've got someone who's in the worship team, who's living with their girlfriend. And we can't get rid of them because, well, they know how to play guitar, so we can't get rid of them. So it's okay that they're up there. Or you have somebody who's leading the youth ministry who just recently got divorced, left his wife. But we can't get rid of him because, he does a great job with the youth ministry. Time after time after time, you see people who are in leadership positions. I'm not just talking about your, filling the pews, leadership positions in the church that have sin in their life. Everyone knows about it, and nobody does anything about it. And a lot of those churches are churches that preach about sin. So from the pulpit, they'll call sin out. They're biblical, they're good churches, and they'll preach about sin. But the culture of their ministry doesn't really match what they're saying from the pulpit. And so they don't have a problem saying sin's wrong, but they don't want to deal with it in their ministry. And so the sin issue is not just for the Corinthian church. It's not a problem only in Corinth, and it's not a problem just with the Catholic Church. It's a problem for every church to deal with, and it's a problem for us. And by the way, in case you're wondering, Paul's dealing with a sexual sin here. It's not just sexual sins. All right, Paul's looking at a specific sin and giving a broader principle. And if you look, he even addresses in verse 11, "But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he's guilty of sexual immorality or greed or is an idolater or a reviler, a drunkard or a swindler." It gives a whole bunch of sins. And if you flip over to 6, 9, and 10, "Do not be deceived, neither the sexually immoral, nor the idolaters, nor the adulteress, nor men who practice homosexuality, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor the drunkards, nor the revilers, nor the swindlers," on and on and on and on. He's not just talking about sexual morality. That's the specific issue he's addressing, but he's talking about sin in general and how the church is responding to sin. And Paul's solution is radically different than what the church's solution is. The church in Corinth is indifferent, it's arrogant, it doesn't care. And Paul says, no. Paul says, remove him. Remove them. Get rid of them. 5 times in the passage. 5 times, Paul tells them to do this. "Let him who has done this be removed from among you. You are to deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. Cleanse out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump. Not even to eat with such a one." And then at the end, he quotes the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 17:7. "Purge the evil one from among you." 5 times. Paul says, get rid of him. Where you're just letting this guy do whatever he wants, where you're just happy that he's there and it's all good, Paul says, no. He has got to go. The solution is really easy. That guy has got to leave. Well, that's pretty harsh. I don't know if I've ever dealt with sin that way. Personally, I've never seen somebody who's in sin, even in the church, and said, I'm not going to eat with them. Well, I'm not even going to talk to them. And so I think it's kind of challenging. When you read that passage, you're sort of, how do we deal with that? And I don't want to do that. But I think one thing, it's important to keep in mind the specific sin that Paul's dealing with and the nature of that sin that Paul's addressing, because I don't think that when you read this passage, you should address every sin in the church in this manner. So if you know someone who has a problem with gossip, I don't want you to, start ignoring them and try and get everybody in the church gathered together so we can all just shun them, and we'll all sit on this side and there'll just be one person on the left side sitting. That's not what Paul's Paul's not trying to make this an overall manual on how to deal with sin. Keep in mind, the first thing that Paul says, this is a guy who's in the church. All right? This is a person in the church. And he even clarifies in verse 9, because apparently this church that's not that good is all confused. They're treating the non-Christians like this, where they can't even treat their fellow brothers like this. He tells them, don't do this with those who are outside the church. You should expect that non-Christians are going to act this way. There's nothing that should be confusing about that. They've not been redeemed. They've not been saved. You're either a slave to sin or a slave to Christ. And why would we expect them to act like Christ? So the sin that he's addressing is a sin that's in the church. It's a public sin. Everybody knows about it. It's not like you stole something and one other person knows about it. It's a public sin. Everybody knows about it, right? When they're reading it, they're all looking at the guy. I'm sure they are. They know exactly who he's talking about. Everybody knows about it. Even the people outside the church know about it. And I think most importantly, well, first, so it's a person in the church, it's a public sin, it's a grievous sin. He says the people outside know it's wrong. So it's nothing like small, it's nothing little or insignificant. It's not a small issue, it's a big deal. Everybody knows it's wrong. But more importantly, it's a sin where that guy's not dealing with it. He doesn't care. He's not repentant, he's not recognizing his sin. He doesn't care. Just like he has the same attitude that the church has, by the way. He's arrogant about it. He doesn't care at all. And I think that kind of explains or helps us understand, why does Paul respond the way that he does? Why does he take such a harsh measure? Why does he say, you've got to get rid of this guy? Why? Why does Paul respond in a way that we never respond? I don't think I've ever seen a church respond in this way. You know when churches respond this way? When it's too late. When it's too late. That's when churches respond this way. When somebody's getting rung up on charges, or they've been arrested, or something horrible has happened. That's when churches respond to sin. They never respond this way. But I think it's important. Paul's addressing sin, and there's two ways that I see that the church today errs in addressing sin. All right, the first way is we're like the Corinthian church. It's probably the more common way. We see sin, we know that it's wrong, but we don't want to get in on it. We don't want to address it. We don't want to deal with it. And so we're indifferent, we let it go, we leave it alone. The second way, which might be a little bit more fun, is we squash them, right? I don't know if you guys have seen this. I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. And you're done. You are out of there. I'm going to destroy you. But when Paul addresses the sin, he does it in a way that it steers clear of both of those errors. He's not going to ignore it, and he's not out to destroy the man. Paul doesn't want to ruin the guy's life. That's not why he's doing this. As a matter of fact, he doesn't even want to see him out of the church, necessarily. He'd like to see him in the church. And Paul doesn't say that the man isn't a Christian. Matter of fact, the whole reason he's telling them this is because he is a Christian. His desire, the desire of Paul, and the desire of us, the desire of the church when dealing with sin, when dealing with the shortcomings of people, when they're dealing with the failures of people, must always be reconciliation. We have always got to seek to improve somebody, to reconcile somebody. As a matter of fact, if you check out verse 5, he says that we are doing this so that he can be saved. And then Paul deals with a similar situation when he's dealing with the church in the Thessalonian church. 2 Thessalonians 3:14 through 15. Paul says, if anyone does not obey what we say in this letter, in this case he's writing to the Thessalonians, but a similar situation, right? Take note of that person and have nothing to do with them, that they might be ashamed. Now this is important. Check this out. Do not regard him as an enemy, but warn him as a brother. Do not regard him as an enemy, but warn him as a brother. We don't think like that too often. I think, in our society, at least this is my sort of take on it, is we kind of have a society that places love as a chief of all things. We don't want to be judgmental. We desire to be tolerant. We desire to be loving. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But that's kind of the way our society is, I think. It's certainly the way is the church that we are. I mean, there's much in Scripture that talks about loving our neighbor. And so we desire, and sometimes we err too much in that we express our love in a way that's not really the best. I mean, what Paul's really saying here, and it's kind of countercultural, he's kind of saying that by shunning this person, by putting them out of your community, by not eating with them, by not talking with them, by making them ashamed, you're actually loving them. You're actually doing them a favor. And that's really countercultural. I read a quote a few weeks ago from C.S. Lewis. And he said, addressing the same situation and kind of, I think, following the same line that Paul was, it is for people whom we care nothing about that we demand happiness on any terms. But it's with our friends, our lovers, our children that we're exacting, and would rather see them suffer much than be happy in a contemptible and estranging modes. What C.S. Lewis realizes and what Paul's realizing is that sometimes if you love somebody, you've got to call them out on things. And sometimes if you really love somebody, that you got to be tough with them. And sometimes if you really love somebody, it's going to sound like you're mean. It's going to come across mean. But the reality is, if we don't take action, if we don't call sin what it is, it's going to have far more damage. And I think in my head, would that person even know that they're sinning? Or would they even, let alone repent of their sin, if no one would call them out? And I wonder how many marriages are ruined because no one in the church decided to look at a man and tell him that he works too much. And I think of how many jobs have been lost because no one had the courage to say, what you're doing in that company is wrong. The way that you're treating your employees is wrong. And all sorts of ways where no one had the courage to call someone that they supposedly love, to call them out on their sin, and because of that, it ended up destroying them. And that's what Paul's hitting at right here. That you need to, if you truly love someone, that sometimes you've got to be tough. Sometimes you got to not eat with them. So first, Paul wants to see the man reconciled. He wants to see reconciliation. He wants to see that guy back in the church. And the second thing that Paul really is concerned about, because he's writing to the church, is the purity of the church. And in verse 6, he says, your boasting is not good, obviously. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And so we get this picture of sin that's all too familiar. It's yeast, right? If you've ever baked bread or you've made like a pizza, you don't put it in and then you only put a little bit of yeast in, right? It's not like 5% of the bread loaf just goes up and the rest stays flat. It goes through the whole thing. Last year in chapel, I did an illustration where I don't even know what I was illustrating, but it fits this. I took a soda and I asked a student if they wanted a soda, and they came up. And I opened up the Mountain Dew, and I spit in it, and I closed it and I shook it up, and then I gave it to her. And I said, well, why don't you want to drink it? I mean, it's just a little bit of spit. No, the whole thing's corrupt, right? You don't want to drink it. And that's what happens in the church. Sin is corrupting. It's corrosive. It's like a cancer, a disease. And once it's there, it spreads and it spreads and it spreads until you take it out, until you destroy it. And eventually it'll corrupt the whole church. And that's what's happening in Corinth. Anybody here ever own a bad puppy? or a bad dog? Anyone? Anyone here have a bad dog? I'd say if you had a bad cat, but I mean, it's all cats. So when I was a kid, I always wanted a dog. I always wanted a dog. All right? Growing up as a kid, I always wanted a beagle. And I would often ask for a dog, and I wanted a dog, and then finally, my dreams came true. I was probably about 12 years old, and my mom got me a dog. It was a beagle Jack Russell mix. So I'm sure you can see where the story's going. His name was Duke, but around the house we called him Satan. And he was an awful dog. I mean, an awful creature. He destroyed everything. He ruined the couch. He was not responsive to any training. He tore up shoes. He ripped up socks. He ruined the carpet. It was an awful dog, an absolutely terrible dog. But he was my dog. And then we only had him for probably about a year, and I went to summer camp, and I came home, and Duke was gone. My mom had enough. Sin's like a terrible dog. It's cute at first, and it might not make a big deal at first. It might just be a shoe at first that it tears up. But if you leave it in your house long enough, it'll just ruin the whole thing. It'll tear everything apart. It'll tear your family up. It'll ruin your life. It'll ruin everything that you have. And it'll eventually ruin the church that you're in. It'll ruin our church if there's sin in your life. So why does Paul respond the way that he does? First, he wants to see the man reconciled. All right? The reason that he's doing this, the reason he's taking this harsh stance on sin, he wants to see that guy brought into the church. He wants him to be back with the people. He wants him reconciled. Second, he wants the church to be pure. He doesn't want the church to get corrupted by this man. In the third way, that Paul desires, why he's doing this, is to protect the witness of the church. It's probably the most important element. It's protection of the witness of the church. I don't know if you've heard the phrase, we are ambassadors of Christ. We're ambassadors of Christ. We're representatives of Jesus. Could you imagine if the United States has ambassadors to all places in the world? Could you imagine if the ambassador of the United States to, let's say, France, was an awful ambassador? Imagine if he stole things, and then when they caught him, he just swore at them, and then he spit in their face, and was just awful, was just nasty. What do you think the French people would think of the United States? Well, they think we're all like that. They think we're all like that. People do the same thing I found with here in the United States, with race or ethnicities, right? I've met people, they hate people from certain groups, from certain places. They hate them. They don't like them. Why? Well, it turns out they've only met like one person from all of Africa, and that person was mean to them. And so now they've got this twisted view where that's what everybody there is like. Or they've met one Philadelphia Eagles fan, and they think all Philadelphia Eagles fans are like that. That's what happens, though. You see, when we have sin in our lives, when there's sin in the church, and when we are corrupt, we become false ambassadors to the people around us. We become a misrepresentation of Jesus. And the Jesus that they see is the Jesus that we are. And that can be a tremendous problem. Whenever I talk to non-Christians, and the first thing they say to me, typically, when I tell them that I work at a church, the first thing that they say to me, they ask me if I can get married. Most of them are in the army, so they actually phrase it in a different way, but you get the point. They ask me if I can get married because they assume that because I work at a church, I must be a priest. Because the reality is for them, for most of them, they don't recognize the difference between Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, Grace Brethren. They don't even care. Maybe some of them do know the difference. They don't even care. All the churches are the same. You know, it's the brick building with the cross on it. All the churches are the same. And for many of them, the image of Christianity that they have is that news story of the Catholic cardinal who's abusing children, or the pastor in their neighborhood who got caught stealing funds from the church, or their coworker who reads his Bible every morning, but then talks about them behind their back, how terrible they are. Or their neighbor who's just a complete jerk, except for on Sundays, on their walk to the car in their nice clothes to go to church. That's the image of Jesus that a lot of people have. It's from us. And it's not from what we say. Most people don't care what you have to say. That's the truth. Most people don't care what you have to say about Jesus or the Bible. They're going to first look at who you are. They're going to look at your life before they listen to anything that you say. And so if we're all messed up, then the Jesus that everyone around us is going to see is a messed up Jesus. And if we're sinful, that's the Jesus that they're going to see. And so what kind of ambassador are you? That's the question. What kind of ambassador are you? Who is the Jesus that everyone around you sees? I don't know if you know this. Everybody here is a teacher. Even if you don't come up here and speak or you don't teach a Sunday school class, all of you are teachers. You're all teaching somebody something. All right? Maybe you're teaching your coworkers that Jesus is okay with gossip. Maybe you're teaching your spouse that Jesus is okay with pornography. Maybe you're teaching your children that Jesus is okay with you neglecting them. Maybe the Jesus that you're teaching about is a liar or a thief or a drunkard or a swindler or greedy. I don't know. I'm not saying that you're verbally saying that's who the Jesus is, you know what I'm saying? But your life might be teaching that. I hope this morning that maybe the Jesus that you're teaching everyone else is the Jesus right here, the real Jesus. But what kind of Jesus are you teaching to everybody else? I'm gonna wrap it up real quick. The big picture is, what's Paul getting at? I don't think he's giving us a manual on how to deal with sin. And the big picture is that the reality is that sin is destructive. And we need to take it seriously. You see that as a theme running through the whole letter of 1 Corinthians. Sin is destructive, and we need to take it seriously. Sin will destroy your life. Sin will destroy your family. It will destroy our church, but most importantly, it will destroy our witness. And I would gather this morning that probably some of us have already seen the damage that sin's done in our lives. We can feel the destruction, maybe right now, of the things that it's done to our life in the past and the things that it's doing now. The reality is that sin is destructive, and we have to take it seriously. So here's the deal. If you're sitting here this morning and you're thinking to yourself, I have something in my life that I need to deal with. If you've come to this sort of realization, and reality is, I hope that none of you are as far gone as the man that Paul's addressing. Most of you I hope, if you have a sin problem, you probably already know about it. And maybe you're trying to deal with it, and maybe you feel guilt about it. I hope you're not as far gone, and I don't think our congregation is nearly as far gone as the Corinthian church. But if you're sitting here this morning and you're thinking, I have a sin problem, and you feel convicted, and you think, what is the Jesus that I'm teaching? This is what I would tell you to do. This is my advice. You can take it or leave it. I'm not a sage, and I'm not a self-help book. I'm not going to give you the 3 steps on how to deal with your sin. But this is the one thing that I would do if I were you. It's something that I've done. All right, so if I know in my heart right now that I'm doing something wrong, something that's dishonoring God and presenting a poor witness, what I would do is I'd look for another person. I'd look for somebody that I trust, somebody that's a Christian, and someone who's outside of the situation. So if you've got a problem with your family, I would look for someone who's outside of your family. And if you have a problem in work, I'd find someone who's outside of work, who can kind of look in the situation and give you some objective outside insight, all right? And this is what I would do if I were you. I would meet with that person, and I would confess my sin to them. Seems sort of strange. Not because if you confess your sin to them, you're going to get forgiven. All right? You're already forgiven. That's the good news. I would confess my sin to them so that I could have accountability. I would let someone else know, hey, this is what I'm dealing with. Keep in mind, a Christian that you know, a strong Christian, who you trust. And I would meet with them and I'd say, this is what I'm dealing with. And maybe it's a church elder, Gene or Carlton or Randy or Jose, or maybe it's someone in your family, or maybe it's a friend or someone else that you know who fits that criteria. But I would find someone and I would tell them what I'm struggling with. And so that they could keep me accountable, and so they could help me and direct me in whatever I have to do. And the truth is, if you want to deal with sin, sometimes it's not easy, all right? No one ever deals with sin by just letting it go. And if you have that wild dog in your house, it's not just going to fix himself. You're not going to come home one day and, oh, he's perfect. You got to take steps. You got to do things. And maybe it means that if you're looking at things or this is just taking too much of your time up, that you get rid of it. Or maybe it means that you need to switch jobs. And some of you, that sounds radical. That sounds crazy. But what if something like that protects your witness? What if something like that protects your family? What if something radical that needs to happen in your life saves your marriage? Or allows your neighbor 10 years down the road to walk into a church and reconsider their faith? So that's my advice for you. If you have a problem with sin, you need to deal with it. You've got to deal with it. Because if you don't, it's just going to destroy you. And the last thing I want to say, we as a church need to take sin seriously. And that's not easy and that's difficult. But we need to have compassion, and we need to have courage, and we need to have the ability to call sin out. Not necessarily in a public manner, but to call sin out and to let people know, hey, what you're doing, it's not working out. What you're doing is wrong. What you're doing is messing people up. What you're doing, you need to change what you're doing. We as a church need to do that. We need to look out for one another. We need to be a community that builds one another up. Sometimes that's tough. And we do all of this so that the lives that we live and the church that we are is an accurate description of the God that we follow. I'm going to close us in prayer. And my prayer this morning, what my prayer has been all week, is that our church would have a pure heart. The song that the praise band played was give us pure hearts, give us clean hands. That's my prayer. That's my prayer for us, for you, and for us as a church. And so if you'll just join me in prayer.